Okay, well, we're going to now go to Eleanor from North Macedonia. She's a signatory of the declaration, and she's going to tell us about what's happening in North Macedonia and the region and in general. So, Elena, can you tell us something about the situation with gender identity ideology in North Macedonia and about the draft law on self-ID, etc.?
Gender identity has not been legally recognized in North Macedonia, and there hasn't been a defined procedure for replacing the sex marker in personal documents with the person's preferred gender identity. And this has kind of led to bureaucratic loopholes and procedures that would greatly differ from one person to the other, and would heavily depend on the will of the person or institution working on the request for changing the sex marker in personal documents. And one such case was a transgender individual who goes by the pseudonym of X, and she had tried to change the sex marker in personal documents for whole 9 years, with all requests and even administrative court orders being rejected or ignored by the institution that's responsible for handling those cases, the Administration for Civil Registration. And finally, with the direct help of some NGOs, a case was raised against the then former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia at the European Court of Human Rights. Of course, North Macedonia lost that case and was obliged to define a legal framework for gender recognition. And this was seen both as a stepping stone by NGOs lobbying for transgender issues and as a chance to lobby for a law that would be as progressive as possible. And it's a promise that made, and it's a promise they're trying to deliver on. The law for on birth registry was unlocked for amendment immediately after the ruling of the European Court for Human Rights. That was in early 2019. But since North Macedonia is generally a conservative country, not much was made on that question, and the government has made sure to take things slowly, both in an attempt to not spark public outrage and to make sure that they keep their place in the government. And in a very discreet and quiet manner, finally, at the end of April this year, a new draft law amendment was approved by the government. This draft law allows a person's sex in personal documents to be replaced with their desired gender identity solely based on self-identification, and not only in the sex marker, but also by replacing the personal identification number of a person, which contains a 3-digit sex marker and a checksum. So basically, out of the 13 numbers, they're going to replace 4. And that law also prohibits that any information of the modification of the personal identification number is visible anywhere, which would basically mean that an individual who decide to change their sex with the gender identity will receive a whole new identity. This replacement is made available to all individuals above the age of 18 who are not currently married. And this, at least by me, is seen as an attempt to preserve the heterosexual marriage, as also in a risk assessment that was completed about a month ago, the only identified risk of the law amendment was, and the only identified risk and a concern were people who are currently divorced and have decided to replace their sex with the desired gender identity. So this law not only greatly undermines women's and children's rights by allowing men easy and uncontrolled access to women's spaces and vulnerable women, but this is also highly homophobic, as it will likely cause homosexual couples to transition so that they could have a partnership that's recognized by the law, considering that homosexual partnerships are not legally recognized in North Macedonia. So this law amendment is currently in its first assembly reading. It has received an EU flag, which is given to laws that are considered of high importance and high priority for the country's assessment talks to the European Union. And it is likely that it will be passed soon. I mentioned that this law has been approved in a very discreet and quiet manner, and I want to comment a bit on that. So the transgender talks and the transgender lobbying, as everywhere, is mainly carried by a foreign-founded network of NGOs, and even they have been very quiet when talking about this law. The draft law was not celebrated, it was not published anywhere, it was not commented on, and even there was an organization who published a celebratory comment on social networks and deleted it shortly afterwards. So there is also a national registry on regulations which allows the public to comment on forthcoming regulations, and there are no comments published regarding this law, although it is allowed to comment on it. None of the comments are being published, so it always says there are no comments on this law. And the law also has almost no media coverage, not even positive, not even negative. Even right-wing media is not covering it. So I somehow have a feeling that this trend will continue, at least until this law is passed, which is honestly extremely worrying, and it's a great threat to women's rights in the country.
Thanks, Elena. And what made you personally realize transgenderism was a threat to women's rights?
Well, I'm pretty young. I'm a 90s child, and maybe it's kind of hard to imagine me on this side of the discussion, since we are a generation that has grown with social media and have been bombarded with the presence of transgender support on social media and the mantra that trans women are women. But a general interest in feminism, which although was pretty liberal at first and rather late, has pushed me in the middle of the transgender discourse, where once you're in, it's not really hard to step out of the group think and see how cognitive dissonant the transgender movement itself is. And that's why it's kind of hard to be grasped by the general public, because my mother is not going to think that trans women are women ever. Because she has to be taught that it's not something that comes naturally, it's something that has to be taught and repeated, and so that such an idea can be acknowledged as the ultimate truth. I have also always read a lot of books and have resorted to reading a ton of books on every side of the discussion, so that I can make up my own mind about things, and also listen to a ton of podcasts and allowed myself to gather as much info on the subject to make up my mind independently. And I think that one of the first things that really left me with an eerie feeling was all the stories about trans identified males and rapists in women's prison, and the funding of the trans lobby, which I think I read in a day, and I just couldn't sleep for a whole 3 days. Also, as a woman, I'm well aware of all the obstacles I faced to get where I am, and all the obstacles I have to face for just being a woman. And I don't think it's anyone's right to in a way, water down the experience of myself and billions of other women around the world by adding men to a category of women that have not and will not share our experiences and our struggles.
So can you tell us about, in general, women's lives in North Macedonia, and where does your government stand on women's rights?
Well, North Macedonia is characterized by a pretty dark period of political history under a populist right-wing government, which in its 10 years heavily impacted women's rights. And during that period, altruistic surrogacy was legalized, but also an anti-abortion law was passed, which probably was the most restrictive one in all of the former Yugoslav countries. This law was so wrongly formulated that it had left women with dead fetuses waiting for several days to get an approval for an abortion because they were too far off in their pregnancies. things have moved on in a different direction with the change of the government in 2016 to a center-left one. The abortion law has been amended. A law on prevention and protection from violence against women and domestic violence has been instated as well. But they really haven't shown a great effectiveness and have allowed the same to slack off with the excuse that at least we are not like the previous ones. And they have made some pretty bad procedural mistakes. For example, an oversight was made when enacting the amendment on protection, on law and prevention and protection against this discrimination when adding the sexual orientation and gender identity. So the whole law ended up being repealed by the Constitutional Court, which basically left everyone, including women, workers, minorities, without an anti-discrimination law until the new amendment was drafted and the whole procedure was gone through again. The government also has a very strong connection with network of foreign funded NGOs, which has actually helped the current political party get to the hot seat. And their relationship has been an ongoing one, which results in mutual support and the self-ID mentioned earlier, as well as efforts to decriminalize prostitutions, which are already being worked on by the network of NGOs and have increased in volumes in the past month. What this government really has failed to do, and what still is a huge problem to all women in Macedonia, is the access to healthcare, especially with the concern of women's health. A lack of gynecologists is evident, and about 10,000 women in only one municipality in the center, in the capital, about 15,000 Roma women haven't had a single gynecologist for over a decade now. And they are one of the most marginalized women in the country. And they're not the only ones with that issue. The COVID pandemic has really shown the government failure to provide healthcare for its citizens. They have basically outsourced the basic health care to private clinics, which significantly deepened class differences, and women are disproportionately affected by it. Another huge issue is domestic violence, where research shows that only about 15% of all incidents are being reported, which is partly caused by the hesitance of police to react to domestic violence whole, as they consider it a private matter between the husband and his wife.
Could you briefly tell us about if there are any groups, women's groups or LGBT groups, supporting women's sex-based rights or opposing gender identity politics?
Well, basically, feminist activism in the country has been made into a full-time profession, and it, in a way, has been monopolized by the network of NGOs I mentioned previously, the foreign-funded. And it's basically the same people who are working on different issues. So, for example, if one is a director of the organization that's fighting for transgender rights, and a program coordinator for the one that's fighting for decriminalizing the prostitution, and it's a member of a third organization, and they're all members of the fourth together. And they've, in a way, monopolized activism. And any chance of independent activism has, in a way, either been suffocated or there hasn't been a climate or interest for it. And there are currently no organization in the country that would step out against transgenderism or the decriminalization of prostitution, at least none that I know of. There are some pretty amazing organizations that do work with certain women's communities. I can mention one CAN here, who is a grassroots organization supporting single parents with an access on single mothers. And their work is truly amazing. They have a significant network who support each other directly, and they help women in gaining economic independence, both through training and with direct assistance. And this is really helpful for women trying to leave their abusive partners. They also have a social business that employs women from this community. They hold feminist activism trainings, and their director is such an amazing woman and a great artist, and her creativity really shines through everything that they do. And there are also a number of similar organizations that mainly concentrate on specific communities, either workers' community or minorities.